I reached for the bottle again, fingers wrapping around the neck of cheap whiskey that had become my most reliable companion over the past 3 years. The apartment felt smaller every day, like the walls were slowly moving inward, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not when I could see the Pacific from my window, stretching endlessly toward the horizon where everything had gone wrong. I used to be the best sonar technician the Navy had. 12 years of service, countless missions, and a reputation for hearing things in the deep that others missed entirely. I could read sound waves like sheet music, picking out submarine signatures from background noise with an accuracy that earned me commendations and the respect of every crew I served with. The ocean had been my second home, her depths holding mysteries I spent my career trying to understand. Now I couldn't even take a shower without hearing those sounds again. The whiskey burned going down, but it dulled the constant ringing in my ears, a souvenir from pressures no human should have survived. I set the glass on the small table next to my chair and looked at the framed certificates covering the wall opposite the window: Distinguished Service Medal, Navy Achievement Medal, Expert Submarine Warfare Pin. All of them felt like artifacts from someone else's life, someone who still believed the ocean was a place where science and technology could solve any problem. That person died 3 years ago in the Mariana Trench, along with 23 of the finest sailors I ever knew. The official report called it a catastrophic equipment failure during routine training exercises. According to the Navy, the USS Connecticut suffered multiple hull breaches at depth, resulting in the loss of most hands before emergency ascent procedures could be implemented. Clean, simple, complete bullshit. I was there. I heard what we found down there, saw what no human was supposed to see. The Navy didn't send us out for training. They sent us hunting for something they knew was waiting in those depths, something that had been sending signals up from the deepest parts of the ocean, signals that didn't match anything in our databases or textbooks. The ice in my glass rattled as I picked it up again, and I realized my hands were shaking. 3 years of therapy, medication, and forced retirement hadn't stopped the tremors that started the day they pulled me out of that life raft. Dr. Martinez said it was trauma response, that my nervous system was still processing what happened down there. He meant well, but he'd never been 40,000 feet below the surface when something the size of a small island decided to notice you. I'd tried to tell him what really happened during our sessions. Tried to explain about the sonar readings that didn't make sense, the sounds that came from living tissue instead of rock formations, the intelligence behind that massive eye that looked right through our hull like we were made of glass. Dr. Martinez would nod and take notes, but I could see it in his face. He thought the pressure had gotten to me, that my brain had created elaborate fantasies to cope with survivor's guilt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was crazy. But crazy didn't explain why the Navy had spent the last 3 years moving me from base to base, facility to facility, making sure I never stayed in one place long enough to talk to the wrong people. Crazy didn't explain why my former crewmates Tyler Foster and Brandon Lee had vanished into the military medical system, transferred to different hospitals every time I tried to contact them. And crazy definitely didn't explain the non-disclosure agreements they'd made me sign, documents so classified that just reading them required security clearance most admirals didn't have. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. The Pacific stretched out below, deceptively calm in the afternoon light. Somewhere out there, maybe 1,000 miles west, the water got deeper than most people could imagine. Deeper than our best submarines were rated to go. Deep enough to hide things that had been waiting in the dark since before humans learned to build boats. The government knew they were down there. That's why they sent us. I'd spent the last 3 years trying to forget, trying to build some kind of normal life in San Diego where I could pretend to be just another veteran dealing with adjustment issues. I got a job at a marine supply store selling navigation equipment to weekend sailors who thought the ocean was their playground. I rented this apartment specifically because it faced away from the harbor, thinking the view of open water might help me feel connected to something I used to love. Instead, It reminded me every single day that the world wasn't what we thought it was. The whiskey bottle was getting light, and the shadows in the room were growing longer. I'd been sitting here for hours, the same way I did most afternoons, trying to decide whether today would be the day I finally told someone the truth. Not a therapist or a government debriefing officer, someone who might actually listen, someone who might believe that the USS Connecticut hadn't died from equipment failure. We'd been murdered, sacrificed, fed to something that lived in places where the pressure should have crushed any living thing into paste, something that had been sending signals up from the deep for longer than our species had existed. The Navy had been tracking those signals for years, maybe decades, and they'd finally decided to send a crew down to make contact. They just hadn't bothered telling us we were never supposed to come back. I picked up the glass again and noticed it was empty. When had that happened? The bottle was almost done too, which meant I'd been drinking more than usual. Dr. Martinez would probably have something to say about that, but Dr. Martinez had never watched his friends die while something the size of a city moved beneath them in the crushing dark. The apartment felt too quiet. Even with the background noise of traffic and distant voices from the street below, the silence reminded me of those moments just before everything went wrong. That terrible quiet when our sonar screen showed something impossible rising from the ocean floor. Something that shouldn't have existed according to every textbook and training manual I'd ever studied. I needed to tell someone. Not because I thought it would change anything. The government had made it clear that certain discoveries were too dangerous for public knowledge, but because 23 good people had died for the truth, and they deserved better than being written off as casualties of mechanical failure. Maybe I was finally drunk enough to be honest about what happened down there. Honest about the mission they'd sent us on, the things we'd found in the deepest part of the ocean, and the reason why only 3 of us had survived to see the surface again. I walked back to my chair and sat down, reaching for the bottle one more time. If I was going to do this, if I was going to break every agreement I'd signed and risk whatever consequences came with telling the truth, I might as well start at the beginning. The beginning, when I still thought the Navy was sending us out to track Chinese submarines, and the deepest thing I had to worry about was maintaining our position without being detected. I walked through the gates of Naval Base Point Loma on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years before everything changed. The salt air felt crisp against my face, and I remember thinking this was exactly where I belonged. 12 years of service had brought me to this moment, assigned to the USS Connecticut, one of the Navy's most advanced Seawolf-class submarines. The technology on board represented the top of underwater warfare, and they wanted me to be their ears in the deep. My duffel bag was light on my shoulder as I made my way across the base toward the submarine piers. I'd packed efficiently, the way you learn to do after years of deployments, bringing only what I'd need for what Captain Walker had described as a 2-week intelligence operation. Standard stuff, really. Track Chinese submarine movements in the South China Sea, gather signal intelligence, stay invisible while doing it. The kind of mission I'd run dozens of times before on older boats with less sophisticated equipment. The Connecticut sat moored at Pier 12, her black hull shining with fresh paint. Even tied up to the dock, she looked predatory. 353 feet of nuclear-powered stealth, designed to hunt other submarines while remaining undetectable herself. I'd read her specifications during the flight from Norfolk, studying every system and capability until I could picture her layout in my head. But seeing her in person was different. This wasn't just another submarine. This was the future of underwater warfare. I checked in with the duty officer and made my way aboard, following known corridors that felt different because of their newness. Everything was clean, precisely manufactured, built to tolerances that made the older boats I'd served on feel like antiques. The sonar compartment was forward of the control room, and when I found it, I had to stop and just look at the equipment for a moment. The AN/BQQ-5 sonar suite took up most of the space, its displays and processing units arranged in a configuration I'd only seen in training manuals, passive arrays that could detect engine signatures from hundreds of miles away. signal processing computers that could isolate and classify contacts faster than any human operator could track them. This was what I'd trained for my entire career, the chance to operate equipment that pushed the boundaries of what was possible underwater. Impressive, isn't it? I turned to find David Rodriguez standing in the doorway, a toolbox in one hand and a technical manual in the other. Dave was shorter than me, built like someone who spent his time crawling through mechanical spaces and fixing things that broke under pressure. We'd served together briefly on the USS Hampton 4 years earlier, and I knew him as the kind of engineer who could make any system work, even when the parts manual said it was impossible. "Dave, good to see you again," I said, stepping back to let him into the compartment. "I was just getting acquainted with our new toys." "Wait until you see what these arrays can pick up," he said, setting his toolbox down near the main processing unit. "I've been running diagnostics all morning, and the sensitivity readings are off the charts. We should be able to hear a shrimp fart at 50 miles. I laughed, but I was already thinking about the possibilities. With equipment this advanced, we could track multiple contacts at the same time while staying completely hidden. The Chinese wouldn't even know we were there until we surfaced back in Pearl Harbor with their entire submarine schedule mapped out. Dave opened his toolbox and pulled out a handheld scanner, beginning his pre-deployment inspection of the sonar systems. "You met Captain Walker yet?" "Not yet. Briefing's at 1400. "He's been wound pretty tight since we got here," Dave said, running the scanner over a bank of processing units. "Been checking and rechecking everything, asking a lot of questions about depth ratings and pressure tolerances. More than usual even for a new boat." That caught my attention. Pre-mission nerves were normal, but experienced captains didn't usually obsess over basic engineering specifications unless they had specific concerns. "What kind of questions?" "Deep water stuff, mostly. How far down we can safely operate, what kind of stresses the hull can handle, that sort of thing." I told him these Seawolf boats are rated for depths that would crush most submarines, but he kept pushing for exact numbers. I filed that information away while Dave continued his inspection. Maybe Walker was just being thorough, making sure he understood his new command's capabilities before taking her into potentially hostile waters. But something about it felt off, like he was planning for scenarios that went beyond standard intelligence gathering. The morning passed quickly as I got to know the Connecticut systems. The sonar equipment was better than anything I'd expected. Response times measured in milliseconds instead of seconds. Processing power that could pick out individual engine signatures from background noise with almost perfect accuracy. Range and sensitivity that opened up tactical possibilities I'd never had before. I was adjusting the passive arrays when Kevin Mitchell found me. Mitch was our navigator, a precise guy who approached his job with the same attention to detail I brought to sonar analysis. We'd overlapped at Naval War College during advanced training, and I knew him as someone who could plot a course through a minefield if the mission required it. "Thompson, right?" he said, though we both knew he remembered me perfectly well. Mitch just liked to be formal until he was sure about the social dynamics on a new boat. "How's the sonar suite looking?" "Like Christmas morning," I said, finishing the array calibration and watching the displays populate with ambient sound data. I can already hear surface traffic from the harbor entrance, and we're still tied to the pier. "What about navigation systems?" "GPS integration is flawless. Inertial guidance is calibrated to within centimeters. This boat could navigate underwater for months without ever surfacing for a position fix." He paused, watching the sonar displays cycle through their startup routines. "Of course, the mission brief says we'll be staying in relatively shallow water for most of the patrol." "South China Sea is pretty shallow compared to the deep Pacific," I agreed. "Should make for easier tracking, fewer thermal layers to deal with." Mitch nodded, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Captain Walker asked me to plot some unusual waypoints during the planning session yesterday. Nothing that changes our basic mission profile, but some of the coordinates were further south than I expected." Before I could ask what he meant, the ship's intercom crackled to life with the familiar sound of the bosun's whistle. All hands. department heads and section leaders to the wardroom for mission briefing. I say again, department heads and section leaders to the wardroom. I secured the sonar systems and made my way aft toward the wardroom, passing crew members I recognized from previous deployments and others who were new to me. 37 sailors total, according to the crew manifest I'd read earlier. A mix of experienced submariners and younger sailors getting their first taste of deep water operations on a frontline boat. The wardroom was larger than what I was used to, but it still felt crowded with 15 department heads and senior petty officers gathered around the central table. Captain Walker stood at the head of the table, a stack of folders in front of him and a large chart of the Western Pacific displayed on the bulkhead behind him. Walker was taller than I'd expected, with perfect military posture and graying hair cut to regulation length. His uniform was spotless, pressed to sharp creases that looked like they could cut paper. But what struck me most was how he acted. Dave had been right about the tension. Walker's jaw was set in a way that suggested he was working to keep his expression neutral, and his eyes kept moving around the room like he was checking to make sure everyone was paying attention. "Gentlemen," Walker began, his voice carrying the authority that came with commanding nuclear submarines in hostile waters. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the secret level. Our mission will take us into the South China Sea for intelligence-gathering operations against Chinese naval forces." He pointed to the chart behind him, where red pins marked various locations scattered across the region between Vietnam and the Philippines. Intelligence shows increased Chinese submarine activity in these areas over the past 6 months. Our job is to track their patrol patterns, identify their operational procedures, and gather signal intelligence on their communication protocols. Walker picked up a red marker and began drawing on the chart, outlining areas of operation and transit routes. "We'll be operating the Connecticut in passive mode for the majority of the patrol. No active sonar, minimal communications, strict electromagnetic silence except for scheduled check-ins every 48 hours. This was exactly what I'd expected to hear, the kind of mission I'd trained for throughout my career. Track enemy submarines without being detected, gather intelligence without revealing our presence, return with actionable information about Chinese naval capabilities. Standard Cold War tactics applied to modern geopolitical realities. "Thompson," Walker said, looking directly at me for the first time, "your sonar expertise will be critical for this operation. I need you to identify and classify every contact we encounter, with particular attention to submarine signatures that don't match known Chinese vessels." "Understood, sir," I replied. "The Connecticut's passive arrays should give us excellent detection range and classification capability." Walker nodded, but I noticed he was checking his watch again, a quick look that seemed almost automatic. "Rodriguez, I need detailed reports on all engineering systems throughout the patrol. Pay special attention to hull integrity monitoring and depth gauge accuracy." Dave looked slightly puzzled by how specific that request was, but he nodded. "Yes, sir. These Seawolf boats are built for deep water operations, but I'll keep close tabs on all structural systems." "Mitchell, navigation will be crucial. I want precise position fixes at all times, with backup systems ready for immediate activation if primary GPS becomes unavailable." The briefing went on for another hour, covering how things worked, communication rules, and backup plans. Everything sounded routine, the kind of detailed planning that came before any successful intelligence mission. But something about Walker's talk felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script that didn't match how he normally spoke. When the formal briefing ended, Walker sent most of the group away but asked me to stay behind. I waited while the wardroom emptied, leaving just the two of us with the chart of the South China Sea and the stack of classified folders. "Thompson," Walker said, his voice lower now that we were alone, "I reviewed your service record before requesting you for this mission. 12 years of submarine service, expert qualification on 4 different sonar systems, commendations for detecting contacts that other operators missed." "Thank you, sir. I take pride in my work." Walker was quiet for a moment, studying the chart behind him like he was memorizing details that hadn't been covered in the briefing. This mission may require you to push your equipment beyond normal operating parameters. Are you prepared for that possibility? The question struck me as odd. Passive sonar systems were designed to operate continuously without significant stress on the equipment. Unless we were planning to go deeper than standard patrol depths, I couldn't imagine what parameters he was referring to. Sir, the Connecticut's sonar suite is rated for all normal submarine operations. What specific parameters are you concerned about? Instead of answering directly, Walker checked his watch again and gathered up the classified folders. Just be prepared for anything, Thompson. This patrol may not follow standard procedures exactly. He left the wardroom without further explanation, leaving me alone with the chart and a growing sense that this mission involved more than tracking Chinese submarine movements. I studied the red pins marking our expected operating areas, trying to understand what Walker hadn't told us during the briefing. The coordinates looked routine at first glance, covering shipping lanes and naval operating areas where Chinese submarines would logically conduct patrols. But when I looked more closely, I noticed something that hadn't registered during the presentation. Several of the southern pins were positioned near areas where the seafloor dropped away into deep water, places where the continental shelf gave way to depths that went down thousands of feet below our normal operating envelope. I walked back to the sonar compartment, thinking about Walker's questions regarding depth ratings and equipment parameters. The Connecticut was capable of diving deeper than most submarines in the world, but standard intelligence missions didn't require extreme depth operations. We'd be tracking surface contacts and shallow diving submarines, staying well within the comfortable operating range of any modern boat. Dave was still working in the compartment when I returned, running final diagnostics on the sonar processing computers. How'd the briefing go? Standard intel mission, I said, settling into the operator's chair and watching the displays cycle through their self-test routines. Track Chinese boats, stay invisible, gather signals intelligence. Anything unusual? I thought about Walker's behavior during the briefing, his specific questions about depth capabilities, and his cryptic warning about pushing equipment beyond normal parameters. Maybe. Captain seems more nervous than usual for a routine patrol. Dave finished his diagnostic sequence and closed the access panel he'd been working on. Well, this is his first mission commanding the Connecticut. New boat, new crew, operating in potentially hostile waters. I'd probably be nervous too. That was logical, but it didn't explain the feeling I'd had during the briefing that Walker was holding back important information. Maybe I was reading too much into normal pre-mission tension, projecting my own excitement about operating advanced equipment onto a captain who was simply being thorough. The afternoon passed in routine preparation activities, final equipment checks, inventory verification, last-minute coordination with shore facilities. By evening, the Connecticut was ready for departure, her nuclear reactor providing power to systems that buzzed with quiet efficiency throughout the boat. I spent the last few hours before we got underway running passive scans of the harbor area, getting familiar with the sonar signature of local traffic and calibrating the arrays for optimal performance. The equipment responded better than anything I'd ever operated, providing clear, detailed information about contacts that would have been barely detectable on older systems. Just before midnight, Captain Walker gave the order to cast off lines and get underway. I watched on the sonar displays as the Connecticut moved away from the pier and out into San Diego Bay, her reactor providing silent propulsion that left almost no acoustic signature for potential listeners to detect. We were beginning what I believed would be a routine intelligence patrol, tracking Chinese submarines with the most advanced underwater surveillance equipment in the world. I felt excited about the mission, confident in my abilities, and proud to be serving aboard one of the Navy's most capable boats. I had no idea that Captain Walker had already received orders that would take us far from the South China Sea, into depths where no submarine was designed to operate, hunting for something that had nothing to do with Chinese naval movements and everything to do with signals that came from places where the ocean floor dropped away into darkness deeper than any human had ever explored. I was running final calibrations on the passive sonar array when the message notification appeared on my personal terminal. 2 days into what should have been a routine intelligence patrol, and we'd gotten into the familiar rhythm of deep water operations. The Connecticut moved through international waters with the silent efficiency that made Seawolf-class boats the top predators of the submarine world. The message was encrypted, marked with security protocols I'd never seen before. When I decoded it, the sender identified himself only as J, and the content was brief. Report to Captain Walker immediately. Bring no materials or documentation. I secured my sonar station and made my way aft toward the captain's quarters, passing crew members focused on their routine duties. The submarine felt different than it had during our first day at sea, more settled, more purposeful. We'd left behind the coastal traffic and commercial shipping lanes, entering the deep Pacific where the only sounds were the subtle vibrations of our own machinery and the distant biological noise that populated every ocean. Walker's quarters were located behind the control room, a small private space that served as both office and sleeping area for the boat's commanding officer. I knocked twice and heard his voice call for me to enter. The captain sat behind a narrow desk bolted to the bulkhead, reading from a tablet computer that displayed what looked like navigation charts. His uniform was perfectly pressed even after 2 days at sea, and he'd kept the same tense attitude I'd noticed during our departure briefing. When he looked up at me, his expression was carefully neutral. "Close the door, Thompson." I pulled the door shut and stood at attention, waiting for him to explain why I'd been summoned. Walker set the tablet face down on his desk and studied me for a moment before speaking. "We've received new orders from Naval Intelligence. Our mission parameters have changed." That caught my attention right away. Mission changes were unusual during submarine patrols, especially when we'd been at sea for less than 48 hours. The Navy typically planned operations with enough detail to avoid mid-course corrections unless something significant had happened. "Sir, what kind of change?" Walker picked up a message form from his desk, looked at it quickly, then set it back down. "We're no longer going to the South China Sea. Instead, we've been told to investigate something unusual at coordinates within the Mariana Trench." I felt my eyebrows go up. The Mariana Trench was hundreds of miles south of our planned operating area, and far deeper than any intelligence mission I'd ever heard of. Standard submarine patrols avoided extreme depth operations, unless there were compelling tactical reasons to risk the equipment and crew. "What kind of anomaly, sir?" "That information comes from John Harrison, a superior whose authority supersedes our original mission. I don't have details about the nature of the anomaly, only coordinates and orders to investigate using our sonar capabilities." The name John Harrison meant nothing to me. In 12 years of submarine service, I'd learned to recognize the names and reputations of senior officers throughout the underwater warfare community. Harrison didn't fit any category I knew, which suggested he operated outside normal naval command structures. "Sir, I'm not familiar with that name. What's his position?" Walker's jaw tightened a bit, and he checked his watch in that quick way I'd noticed during our briefing when we left. "Harrison works under Naval Intelligence with permission I'm not allowed to question. His orders are classified above what I can access, which means we follow them without talking about it." Something about Walker's tone told me he wasn't totally comfortable with the situation either. Military officers were trained to follow orders without hesitation, but experienced commanders also developed gut feelings about when missions went beyond normal limits. This felt like one of those moments. "What are my specific responsibilities for this new mission?" "Prepare the sonar systems for extreme depth operations. I need maximum sensitivity and range from our passive arrays, with particular attention to detecting anomalous signals that don't match known geological or biological signatures." I thought about the equipment specifications I'd memorized during our transit from San Diego. The Connecticut's sonar suite was designed for deep water operations, but extreme depth introduced complications that pushed even advanced systems toward their operational limits. Water pressure affected sound transmission in ways that required careful calibration, and the acoustic environment at abyssal depths contained interference patterns that could mask or distort contact signatures. Sir, how deep are we talking about? The equipment will need specific calibration depending on our operating depth. Walker looked at the message form again, reading coordinates that meant nothing without reference to depth charts. The anomaly is located at approximately 35,000 feet below surface level. 35,000 feet. I had to process that number for a moment to make sure I'd heard correctly. That was deeper than Mount Everest was tall, deeper than any submarine was designed to operate safely. The Connecticut's hull was rated for depths that would crush most boats, but 35,000 feet approached the absolute limits of what our pressure vessel could handle. Captain, that's extremely deep for submarine operations. Are we certain our hull integrity can handle that kind of pressure? Rodriguez has assured me that the Connecticut specifications include a safety margin beyond our normal operating envelope. We won't be staying at depth longer than necessary to investigate the anomaly and gather required intelligence. I wanted to ask more questions about the nature of this anomaly and why it required such extreme measures to investigate, but Walker's demeanor suggested the conversation was moving toward conclusion. He gathered the message forms on his desk and secured them in a locked drawer. Thompson, this information is classified at levels that require absolute confidentiality. No crew member outside this room is to know the specific nature of our new mission. If anyone asks about our course change, we're pursuing a high-value intelligence target that requires investigation. Understood, sir. Begin preparations immediately. I want those sonar systems optimized for deep-water operations within 6 hours. We'll be changing course after the next scheduled communication window with Fleet Command. I left the captain's quarters with my mind racing through the technical requirements for recalibrating our sonar arrays. Extreme depth operations required adjustments to every aspect of the system. Frequency selection, power output, signal processing algorithms, even the physical alignment of the passive arrays to account for pressure-induced hull deformation. Walking back toward the sonar compartment, I passed Dave Rodriguez coming out of the engine room. He looked up from the technical manual he was carrying and nodded in my direction. Thompson, how's the sonar suite performing? Perfectly so far. Actually, I need to talk to you about depth operations. What's the Connecticut's actual operational ceiling? Dave's expression became more serious and he glanced around to make sure we weren't overheard by other crew members. Officially, we're rated to depths that exceed any tactical requirement. Unofficially, I've been running stress calculations since we left port, and Captain Walker's questions about extreme depth capabilities have me concerned. What kind of calculations? Hull compression ratios, pressure differential limits, emergency ascent capabilities from various depths. The kind of analysis you do when someone's planning to push a boat beyond normal operating parameters. I thought about the coordinates Walker had given me and the problem that supposedly needed investigation at 35,000 feet below the surface. If we had to operate at depths approaching the limits of our hull design, what would you need to monitor? Dave closed his technical manual and looked directly at me. Everything. Hull stress indicators, pressure systems, emergency ballast controls, backup life support systems. Are we talking about a specific scenario here? I wanted to tell him about the mission change and the coordinates we'd been given, but Walker's instructions about keeping things secret were clear. Dave deserved to know what kind of stresses his engineering systems might face, but I couldn't share classified information without permission. Just theoretical planning, making sure I understand our capabilities if we encounter situations that require deep water operations. Dave didn't look entirely convinced by my explanation, but he accepted it with the professionalism that came from years of submarine service. Well, theoretically, these Seawolf boats are built to handle more pressure than we'd ever encounter in normal operations. But extreme depth isn't just about hull integrity. You've got to consider acoustic performance, navigation accuracy, communication capabilities, and emergency procedures that might not work the same way under crushing pressure. What about sonar performance at those depths? Sound transmission changes significantly as water pressure increases. Your passive arrays should still function, but you'll need to recalibrate everything to account for pressure-induced acoustic distortion. And depending on the thermocline layers at depth, You might lose range and accuracy compared to standard operating conditions. I made mental notes about the technical challenges I'd need to address during the sonar recalibration process. Dave was right about the complexity of deep-water operations. Every system on the submarine would face stresses and environmental conditions that pushed beyond normal design parameters. Thanks for the input. I better get back to my equipment and start running diagnostics. Dave nodded and continued toward the forward torpedo room, leaving me to walk the rest of the way to the sonar compartment alone. I was thinking about the conversation with Walker and the mysterious anomaly that required investigation at impossible depths. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, but I couldn't identify exactly what was bothering me. The sonar compartment buzzed with the quiet efficiency of electronic systems operating at peak performance. I settled into the operator's chair and began pulling up calibration menus, preparing to reconfigure the equipment for extreme depth operations. The process would take several hours of careful adjustment, testing each component to ensure optimal performance under conditions we'd never encountered before. As I worked through the technical procedures, I found myself thinking about the encrypted message that had started this chain of events. John Harrison, whoever he was, possessed enough authority to redirect an entire submarine mission with a single communication. That level of influence suggested connections to intelligence agencies or military commands that operated outside normal Navy hierarchies. The Connecticut began a subtle course change sometime during my third hour of sonar recalibration. I felt it in the slight change of the boat's motion, the way our forward momentum adjusted to a new heading that would take us south toward the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. Other crew members would notice the change and start asking questions about our destination, but Walker had prepared a cover story about pursuing high-value intelligence targets. I wondered what kind of anomaly existed at 35,000 feet below the surface that justified such extreme measures to investigate. Geological formations didn't typically require submarine reconnaissance, and no biological organisms were known to exist at depths where the pressure would crush any living tissue into paste. Maybe we were tracking a foreign submarine that had somehow managed to operate in the deep ocean, or investigating wreckage from an experimental vessel that had exceeded its operational limits. By evening, I'd completed the sonar recalibration and run diagnostic tests that confirmed the equipment was optimized for deep water operations. The passive arrays showed enhanced sensitivity at the frequencies most likely to penetrate the acoustic environment we'd encounter at extreme depth. Signal processing algorithms had been adjusted to account for pressure-induced distortion, and the display systems were configured to highlight unusual contacts that didn't match known acoustic signatures. Mitch found me during the dinner hour, carrying navigation charts and looking concerned about something he'd discovered during course planning. "Thompson, we're heading towards some pretty deep water. The captain asked me to plot coordinates that put us right over the deepest part of the Mariana Trench." "What's the depth at our destination?" "Bottom contours show abyssal plains that drop away to more than 36,000 feet below sea level. That's deeper than any submarine is designed to operate safely." I thought about the strange coordinates Walker had given me and realized we were approaching the exact location where something had been detected that required investigation by naval intelligence. Mitch was right about the operational risks. Even the most advanced submarines couldn't safely operate at depths where the water pressure approached 1,100 pounds per square inch. Maybe we're just transiting through the area to reach our actual patrol zone. Could be, but the waypoints I've been given suggest we're planning to spend time there. Multiple position fixes, loitering patterns, the kind of navigation planning you do when you're investigating something specific rather than just passing through. Mitch spread his charts on the table between us, pointing to the coordinates that marked our apparent destination. The area was hundreds of miles from any major shipping lanes or naval operating zones, isolated in the deepest part of the Pacific where the ocean floor dropped away into trenches that represented some of the most extreme environments on Earth. "Have you heard anything about what we're supposed to be looking for out there?" I wanted to tell him about the mission change and the anomaly we'd been ordered to investigate, but Walker's instructions about confidentiality prevented me from sharing any details. Mitch deserved to know why we were heading into dangerous waters, but I couldn't violate direct orders from the captain. Nothing specific. Orders change sometimes during submarine patrols. We'll know more when we get there. Mitch looked unhappy with my non-answer, but he accepted it and picked up his navigation charts. Well, I'll have exact position fixes ready for whatever we're planning to do down there. Just hope the equipment can handle the depth. After he left, I sat alone in the compartment thinking about the questions that had been building throughout the day. John Harrison's authority to redirect our mission. The coordinates that placed us over the deepest part of the Mariana Trench. The anomaly that required investigation at depths no submarine should attempt to reach. Walker's obvious discomfort with orders he couldn't question or discuss. I returned to the sonar station and began running final checks on the equipment I'd adjusted for extreme depth operations. The systems worked perfectly, displaying acoustic data with the clarity that made the Connecticut one of the most capable surveillance platforms in the world. Tomorrow, we'd find out what kind of anomaly existed in the crushing darkness 35,000 feet below the surface, and whether our advanced technology could detect and classify something that had attracted the attention of mysterious superiors with authority beyond normal naval command structures. The descent began 12 hours later, when Captain Walker gave the order to take the Connecticut deeper than any submarine in our fleet had ever gone. I watched the depth gauge climb past our normal operating ceiling, the numbers increasing with a steady persistence that made my stomach tighten. 15,000 feet, 20,000, 25,000. Each 1,000 feet added another layer of crushing pressure against our hull, water that wanted to compress our submarine into a metal pancake the size of a dinner plate. The sonar displays showed clean readings as we dropped through the water column, but I kept adjusting the calibration settings I'd spent hours perfecting. At these depths, sound transmission changed in ways that challenged everything I'd learned about underwater acoustics. The ocean itself became denser, more resistant to the passage of sound waves, requiring constant fine-tuning to maintain the best performance. Hull stress is approaching yellow zone parameters, Dave called out from his engineering station, his voice carrying across the control room with professional calm that didn't quite mask his underlying concern. Captain, we're getting close to operational limits. Walker stood behind the periscope housing, hands clasped behind his back, watching the depth gauge with the same focused attention I'd seen during our departure briefing. His uniform remained perfectly pressed even after hours of submarine operations, but I could see tension in the way he held his shoulders. Continue descent, Walker ordered. Monitor hull integrity, but maintain current rate. I heard Dave take a sharp breath, followed by the sound of him adjusting control settings at his station. The Connecticut was built to handle extreme pressure, but we were entering territory that pushed the boundaries of even Seawolf-class engineering. Every rivet, every weld, every seal in our pressure hull now carried loads that went beyond normal design specifications. The submarine's interior filled with subtle sounds I'd never heard before. Creaking noises that seemed to come from the metal structure itself, tiny pops and groans as our hull compressed under the mounting pressure. These weren't emergency-level sounds, not yet, but they represented the boat talking to us in a language that said we were operating outside our comfort zone. 30,000 feet. My sonar screens continued showing empty water below us, the kind of acoustic void you'd expect in the deepest part of the Pacific. No biological contacts, no geological features, just the endless dark that stretched down toward the ocean floor still miles beneath our position. I made minor adjustments to the passive arrays, keeping them fine-tuned for maximum sensitivity as we approached the coordinates Harrison had provided. Navigation systems are showing some drift, Mitch announced from his station, tapping his displays with the precise movements of someone trying to troubleshoot equipment that wasn't responding correctly. GPS contact is getting weaker, and inertial guidance is requiring frequent corrections. That wasn't surprising at our current depth. Navigation equipment depended on systems that worked best within normal operational limits. The further we pushed beyond those limits, the more likely we were to run into unexpected problems with electronics made for standard submarine warfare rather than deep ocean exploration. 32,000 feet. I found myself checking and rechecking my sonar calibration, making sure the equipment stayed properly set up as water pressure continued building around us. The acoustic environment at this depth felt different from anything I'd experienced, denser and more resistant to sound transmission. My passive arrays still worked perfectly, but they were working harder to maintain the same level of sensitivity I'd expect at normal patrol depths. "Thompson, what's your sonar picture showing?" Walker asked, moving closer to my station without taking his attention off the depth gauge. "Clear water, sir. No contacts above background noise level. We're still approximately 7,000 feet above the coordinates you provided." Walker nodded but didn't respond immediately. I could see him calculating distances and descent rates, probably trying to determine exactly when we'd reach the position where this mysterious anomaly was supposed to exist. Whatever we were looking for had been detected by someone with enough authority to redirect our entire mission, but so far my equipment showed nothing but empty ocean. 35,000 feet. Dave's voice cut through the control room with a sharp edge that made everyone pay attention. "Captain, hull stress indicators are entering the red zone. We're approaching maximum safe operating depth for this vessel." I looked up from my sonar displays to see Walker's reaction. His jaw tightened slightly, and he checked his watch with that quick, involuntary movement I'd noticed during our mission briefings. But he didn't give the order to level off or begin emergency ascent procedures. "Continue descent to 38,000 feet, Walker said, his voice carrying the authority of command even though I could hear the tension underneath. "Then we'll reassess our position." Dave's protest was immediate and professional. "Sir, that depth approaches the absolute limits of our pressure hull design. If we encounter any kind of structural compromise at that depth, emergency ascent procedures may not be sufficient to prevent catastrophic failure." "Noted. Continue descent." I watched Dave's hands move across his engineering controls, adjusting systems to handle pressure loads that pushed our submarine toward the edge of what was physically possible. His technical expertise told him we were entering dangerous territory, but Walker's orders left no room for discussion or delay. The creaking sounds grew more frequent as we went down past 36,000 feet. Not the sharp crack of failing metal, but the continuous conversation between our pressure hull and the crushing environment that surrounded us. Every structural component was now carrying loads that represented the upper limits of what our designers had calculated as survivable. 37,000 feet. I made final adjustments to my sonar arrays, optimizing them for maximum performance at depths where no submarine was supposed to operate. The passive sensors continued functioning flawlessly, but I could feel the ocean pressing against us with a weight that seemed to want to squeeze our tiny metal bubble into nothingness. Then, at 38,000 feet, something appeared on my displays that made me forget about hull stress and structural limits and every other concern I'd been tracking during our dive. "Contact," I announced, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Bearing 270, range approximately 2 miles, depth approximately 40,000 feet. Walker was beside my station before I finished speaking, leaning over my shoulder to look at the sonar displays. "Classification?" I looked at the contact signature, trying to make sense of readings that went against everything I knew about underwater acoustics. The shape was huge, easily the size of a small island, but it showed up on my screens with the kind of acoustic characteristics I linked with living tissue rather than rock formations or man-made objects. "Unknown, sir. The signature doesn't match any geological formation in our databases, and it's too large to be any known vessel or marine animal." But even as I said those words, I was noticing something else about the contact that made my hand start shaking slightly as I changed the sonar controls. The acoustic signature wasn't static like a mountain or seamount would be. Instead, it beat with a regular rhythm that carried through the water with enough power to register clearly on our passive arrays from 2 miles away. "Captain, this contact appears to be pulsing. Regular intervals, approximately 12 seconds between peaks." The rhythm reminded me of something I couldn't quite place at first. a biological pattern that felt known, even though it came from something impossibly massive. Then I realized what my mind had already picked up on, and the understanding hit me like cold water flooding through a broken hull. It sounded like a heartbeat. "Sir, recommend we investigate closer," Walker said after studying my displays for several seconds. "Take us down toward that contact." "Captain." Dave's voice carried across the control room with barely controlled alarm. "We're already at the absolute limits of safe operation. Descending further risks catastrophic structural failure." Walker's response was immediate and final. "Continue descent. We need to determine the nature of that contact." I felt the Connecticut angle downward, her ballast tanks adjusting to carry us deeper into water that wanted to crush us like an empty beer can. As we went down, the pulsing signature grew stronger and more distinct on my sonar displays. Each rhythmic beat sent through the ocean with such power that I could feel it vibrating through our submarine's hull. This wasn't random geological activity or equipment malfunction. The pattern was too regular, too consistent, too powerful to be anything except biological. But nothing alive could exist at these depths, where the pressure would compress any known life form into paste within seconds. "Navigation equipment is malfunctioning," Mitch announced, his voice tight with stress. "Compass readings are erratic, and inertial guidance systems are showing impossible drift patterns." I kept my attention on the sonar displays, watching the huge contact grow larger and more clear as we got closer. In 12 years of submarine service, I'd looked at thousands of acoustic signatures from every category of underwater object: ships, submarines, whales, rock formations, even experimental vehicles that pushed the boundaries of underwater technology. This matched nothing in my experience or training. The rhythmic pulsing continued with mechanical precision, each beat strong enough to vibrate through our pressure hull and into the metal framework that surrounded us. Whatever was making this acoustic signature had more power than any biological organism should be able to produce. As we went down past 39,000 feet, getting close to the source of the pulsing, I realized we weren't investigating a rock anomaly or tracking a foreign submarine or examining wreckage from some experimental vessel. We were getting close to something alive. Something impossibly, incomprehensibly large that existed in the crushing darkness, where nothing should be able to survive. 40,000 feet below the surface, my sonar screens showed something that challenged every assumption I'd held about life on Earth. The contact wasn't a geological formation or wreckage from some experimental vessel. It was alive, and it was rising from the deep ocean floor toward our position with deliberate, purposeful movement that sent massive displacement waves through the water around us. "Contact is ascending," I announced, my voice barely steady as I watched the acoustic signature expand across my displays. Rate of climb, approximately 500 feet per minute. The numbers didn't capture what I was actually seeing on the sonar screens. The creature's body stretched across miles of ocean floor, larger than any landmass I'd ever mapped during 12 years of submarine service. Glowing patterns pulsed along what appeared to be its exterior surface, creating light signatures that registered on our passive arrays as distinct acoustic events. Walker moved closer to my station, his hands gripping the back of my chair as he studied the displays. "How large is this contact?" I recalibrated the sonar range twice before answering, unable to believe the measurements my equipment was providing. "Sir, based on acoustic signature analysis, the contact measures approximately 3 miles in length and nearly 2 miles in width. Depth: the creature appears to extend down beyond the range of our sonar penetration." The words sounded impossible even as I spoke them. Nothing that large could exist in Earth's oceans, let alone at depths where the pressure would crush any known biological structure. But my sonar equipment was functioning perfectly, providing detailed readings that confirmed the presence of something alive moving through the water beneath us. The creature's ascent created powerful currents that began affecting our submarine's position and attitude. I felt the Connecticut move sideways, pushed by massive water displacement that our ballast control systems couldn't compensate for adequately. "Engineering report," Walker called out, his voice carrying new tension as he felt the boat's movement change. Dave's response came from across the control room, edged with controlled panic. "Captain, we're getting weird current patterns that don't match any ocean models. Something down there is moving enormous amounts of water." As the creature rose toward our position, more details became visible on my sonar displays. The glowing patterns weren't random biological stuff, but organized structures that pulsed in complex sequences, creating sound signatures that looked like nothing in any database I'd studied. The patterns seemed to follow mathematical progressions, like a language made of light and sound transmitted through the crushing darkness. 35,000 feet. 30,000. 25,000. The creature's massive shape filled my screens completely now, rising through the water column with movements that created sound waves powerful enough to vibrate through our pressure hull. Each pulse sent tremors through the submarine's metal framework, creating frequencies that made the entire boat buzz like a struck tuning fork. Then, at 20,000 feet below our position, the creature's rise stopped. For several seconds, the only sounds in our control room were the quiet buzz of electronic systems and the increasingly frequent creaks from our compressed hull. The massive contact held its position in the water column, no longer rising but maintaining perfect neutral buoyancy in a way that suggested conscious control rather than passive floating. "Sir," I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow attract the creature's attention. "The contact has stopped ascending. It's holding position directly below us." Walker leaned over my shoulder to look at the sonar displays, and I could feel how tense he was. "What's it doing?" Before I could answer, something appeared on my screens that made my hands start shaking. A section of the creature's huge body was changing, rising upward from the main mass like a mountain growing from the seafloor. The acoustic signature showed organic tissue moving with clear purpose, reshaping itself into a structure that reached toward our submarine. "Captain, part of the creature it's extending something toward our position. Range is decreasing rapidly." The extending appendage measured hundreds of feet in diameter, larger than our entire submarine, moving through the water with smooth movements that belonged to something perfectly suited to the deep ocean environment. As it got closer, I could see more detail in its acoustic signature. Complex internal structures that pulsed with the same rhythmic patterns I'd been tracking for hours. 15,000 feet below us. 10,000 feet. 5,000 feet. "Emergency ascent," Walker ordered, his voice sharp with command authority. "All ballast tanks, emergency blow. Get us to the surface now." Dave's hands moved across his controls with practiced efficiency, triggering emergency procedures designed to bring the Connecticut to the surface as quickly as possible. I heard the roar of compressed air forcing water out of our ballast tanks, felt the submarine's nose angle upward as we began an emergency ascent. But the creature's massive presence had changed the water conditions around us in ways that made normal submarine operations impossible. Instead of rising toward the surface, we found ourselves caught in a powerful downward current that pulled us deeper even with our emergency ballast procedures. "Ascent systems are not responding," Dave announced, his voice tight with professional calm that couldn't hide his growing alarm. "We're being pulled down by current patterns that don't follow standard oceanographic models." The creature's long arm kept rising toward us, and I realized with growing fear that what I was seeing on my sonar displays was only a tiny part of something incredibly huge. The main body stayed miles below us, so large that our equipment couldn't figure out its edges, while this single arm was big enough to swallow our submarine completely. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. "Contact with extending appendage in 30 seconds, I announced, watching the range close with mechanical precision on my displays. Walker grabbed the submarine's communication system. "All hands, prepare for impact. Emergency stations, emergency stations." The first contact was gentle, almost delicate. The creature's appendage brushed against our submarine's hull with the kind of careful touch you might use to examine a fragile object. But even that gentle contact created acoustic signatures that registered on my sonar screens as massive structural vibrations. Then I saw something on my displays that made me forget about submarine operations, emergency procedures, and everything else I'd learned during 12 years of underwater warfare. Part of the creature's extended appendage was opening, revealing an internal structure that measured larger than a football stadium. And within that structure, looking directly at our submarine through 40,000 feet of crushing water pressure, was an eye. The eye was perfectly formed, with organic complexity that suggested intelligence beyond anything I'd encountered in nature or military service. It focused on our submarine with clear awareness, studying us with the same careful attention a scientist might give to bacteria under a microscope. The pressure of being watched by something so vast and intelligent hit me harder than the physical water pressure surrounding our hull. This wasn't a mindless deep-sea creature or some basic organism adapted to extreme environments. The intelligence behind that massive eye was very old, powerful, and completely alien to human understanding. "Jesus Christ," Dave whispered from his engineering station, his voice carrying across the control room in the sudden silence that had fallen over our crew. The creature's look at our submarine went on for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. I watched its eye move with careful precision, tracking along our hull from bow to stern, taking in every detail of our construction and design. The glowing patterns along its body pulsed faster now, creating complex light sequences that seemed to be processing information about our presence. Then the creature began to move again, and our situation changed from impossible to catastrophic. The massive appendage that held us started to contract, pulling our submarine deeper into the creature's grip with unstoppable force. Our emergency ballast systems were completely useless against the downward pressure created by something that could displace ocean water by the cubic mile. "Hull stress indicators are redlining," Dave called out, his voice rising above the groaning sounds that now filled our submarine. "Captain, the pressure hull is approaching failure parameters." I felt the Connecticut's metal framework beginning to buckle under forces that went way beyond every safety margin built into our design. The gentle creaking sounds I'd been hearing for hours were replaced by sharp cracks and metallic screams as our pressure vessel started to collapse. Water began seeping through seals and joints that had never been intended to handle the crushing forces we now faced. Emergency alarms blared throughout the submarine, warning systems announcing multiple hull breaches and catastrophic structural failure. "Emergency surface procedures are not responding," Dave announced, his voice now edged with panic. "We're being pulled down faster than our ballast systems can compensate." The creature's tentacles, I could see them clearly now on my sonar displays, each one hundreds of feet thick and miles long, began wrapping around our submarine with movements that seemed almost gentle. But gentle or not, the physical forces involved were beyond anything our hull could withstand. The first major structural failure came without warning. A loud crack bounced through the control room, followed by the sound of rushing water as seawater found its way through a ruptured seal in the forward compartment. Emergency lighting flashed on as our main electrical systems began shorting out from water contact. "Flooding in the forward torpedo room," someone announced over the communication system, though I couldn't identify the voice above the growing chaos of emergency alarms and structural failure sounds. Dave was at his engineering station, frantically trying to control damage that had already exceeded our submarine's ability to survive. Water was entering the boat faster than our pumping systems could remove it, and the creature's continued descent was pulling us toward depths where even minor hull damage would become instantly fatal. "Watertight doors are not responding to manual controls," he called out, his voice barely audible above the sounds of our submarine dying around us. "Hydraulic systems are failing due to pressure differential." I watched my sonar displays show the creature's huge body continuing to go down. carrying us deeper into the deep ocean with each passing second. The glowing patterns along its body flashed with increasing intensity, creating light shows that showed up on our acoustic sensors as complex data streams. 50,000 feet, 60,000 feet, 70,000 feet. At these depths, water pressure got to levels that could compress our submarine into a ball of twisted metal within seconds. Only the creature's embrace was keeping us from collapsing completely. But that protection came at the cost of being pulled ever deeper into an environment where human survival was impossible. The second major hull breach happened near the navigation compartment, where Mitch had been trying to maintain our position data even though our GPS and inertial guidance systems had completely failed. I heard him scream as seawater flooded through a crack in the pressure hull, filling the compartment faster than anyone could escape. "Mitch!" Dave shouted, abandoning his engineering station to reach the navigation area. But it was too late. The water pressure at our current depth turned even small hull breaches into catastrophic failures that could fill an entire compartment in seconds. I watched Dave reach the navigation compartment just as another section of our pressure hull gave way with a sound like thunder. The bulkhead separating his position from the rest of the submarine buckled and collapsed, crushing him instantly under tons of twisted metal and rushing seawater. My sonar station was still functioning somehow, providing acoustic data about our descent into depths where no submarine had ever operated. The readings showed we were now below 80,000 feet, approaching the deepest parts of ocean trenches where the pressure would flatten our submarine like a beer can. But through the chaos of our submarine's destruction, through the sounds of crew members dying and pressure hull failing, I kept my attention on the creature that held us in its grasp. Not because I thought understanding it would save us, but because I realized I was witnessing something that challenged every assumption humanity had made about life on Earth. The bioluminescent patterns along the creature's body weren't random biological events. They were a form of communication, complex data streams that sent information between different parts of its massive body. I was watching an intelligence that existed on a scale so vast that our entire submarine was barely noticeable, like a single cell in a human body. The shock of that realization hit me harder than the physical forces destroying our boat. We weren't just dealing with some deep-sea monster or prehistoric remnant that had somehow survived in the ocean depths. This creature had intelligence that operated on geological timescales, awareness that covered entire ocean basins, knowledge that had been building up since before human civilization existed. Through my failing sonar displays, I caught glimpses of the creature's true extent. Its body stretched across ocean trenches like living mountain ranges, connected by neural networks that spanned thousands of miles beneath the seafloor. What we had encountered was just one small part of something so massive that it existed as a parallel ecosystem in Earth's deepest waters. The creature's eye looked at me again, and I felt its attention like a physical weight pressing against my consciousness. In that moment of contact, something passed between us that went beyond normal sensory experience. Knowledge, understanding, recognition of what our species had stumbled into during our exploration of the deep ocean. Humanity had never been alone on this planet. We had simply been too small and too shallow to notice the intelligences that lived in the crushing darkness beneath miles of seawater. Very old beings that had watched the rise and fall of countless species from their deep domains, entities so vast and powerful that governments would sacrifice entire submarine crews just to study them. The final hull breach came as we passed 90,000 feet depth, pressure levels that crushed our submarine's remaining structural integrity like an eggshell. Water flooded through every compartment with explosive force, shorting out our electrical systems and plunging us into darkness. My last coherent memory was clinging to my sonar station as seawater filled the control room, feeling the creature's massive tentacles adjust their grip on our dying submarine. The being's presence created pressures that went beyond the physical, touching something in my mind that left permanent changes in how I understood reality. Everything went dark. I woke up floating. The first sensation was water lapping against something beneath me, followed by the taste of salt and blood in my mouth. My eyes opened to reveal orange fabric stretched overhead, the distinctive color of Navy emergency equipment swaying gently with ocean swells. An emergency life raft. I was lying in an emergency life raft on the Pacific surface, 18 hours removed from a submarine that had been crushed at 90,000 feet. My body felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately catalog. Every joint ached with deep, bone-level pain that suggested something fundamental had been damaged during whatever process brought me from the crushing depths to this inflatable sanctuary. When I tried to sit up, sharp pains shot through my chest and arms, the kind of tissue damage associated with severe decompression injuries. The sound of rotor blades cut through the ocean air above me. I managed to turn my head enough to see Coast Guard helicopters circling in a search pattern, their bright orange and white paint schemes stark against the blue Pacific. Rescue boats moved between small clusters of life rafts scattered across maybe half a mile of ocean surface, their engines creating diesel exhaust plumes that drifted on the morning breeze. Other rafts, other survivors. I counted 6 life rafts total, including my own, each one riding the swells with the distinctive heavy movement of emergency flotation devices designed for survival rather than comfort. 2 of the rafts appeared to have occupants who weren't moving, their orange fabric sheltering unconscious figures that could only be other crew members who had somehow escaped the Connecticut's destruction. The memories came in fragments that didn't connect into any coherent sequence. Massive tentacles wrapping around our submarine's hull, water flooding through ruptured pressure seals, that enormous eye looking directly at me through 40,000 feet of crushing ocean, then nothing, a complete blank where the process of reaching the surface should have been stored in my consciousness. How does someone survive a submarine crushing at depths that exceed every safety margin ever calculated? How do 7 crew members escape a pressure vessel failure that should have killed everyone instantly? The physics made no sense, but the evidence surrounded me in the way of Coast Guard rescue operations and the taste of seawater that proved I had somehow made it to the surface alive. One of the rescue boats approached my raft, its hull cutting through the swells with the purposeful movement of a vessel on an active search mission. Coast Guard personnel in orange survival suits moved along the gunnels, preparing rescue equipment while their boat maneuvered to bring them alongside my position. "Survivor conscious in raft number 4, someone called out, their voice carrying across the water with practiced efficiency. "Prepare medical evacuation procedures." A Coast Guard medic leaned over the side of their boat as it came alongside my raft, his hands already reaching for medical equipment attached to his vest. His movements had the careful precision of someone trained to handle survivors suffering from severe trauma and decompression injuries. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice cutting through the sounds of engines and rotor blades. "Can you tell me your name?" "Michael Thompson, Petty Officer First Class, USS Connecticut." The words came automatically, part of the identity protocol drilled into every submarine crew member for emergency situations. "Good. We're going to get you medical attention right away. Try not to move too much until we can evaluate your condition." The medic's hands moved across my body with professional efficiency, checking pulse points and examining my arms and legs for obvious injuries. His touch triggered waves of pain that confirmed the deep tissue damage I'd been feeling since waking up. Whatever had happened during my escape from the submarine had left my body dealing with pressure-related injuries that should have been fatal. "Severe decompression symptoms," the medic announced to his team. "Multiple sites of tissue damage consistent with rapid pressure change. Prepare emergency medical transport." They moved me from the life raft to their rescue boat with movements designed to minimize additional trauma to someone suffering from decompression sickness. The boat's deck felt solid and stable after hours floating on the ocean swells, but the pain in my joints and muscles made every movement an exercise in careful endurance. From the rescue boat's deck, I could see the other survivors being pulled from their life rafts. Tyler Foster was unconscious, his body showing the clear signs of severe decompression injuries that had made him unresponsive during the rescue operations. Brandon Lee appeared to be in similar condition, unconscious and needing immediate medical help from Coast Guard personnel. 37 crew members had gone down into the Mariana Trench aboard the Connecticut. 6 survivors floated in emergency life rafts on the Pacific surface. The math of that survival rate suggested something had stepped in during our submarine's destruction, something that had selectively kept a handful of crew members alive, while allowing the rest to die in the crushing depths. The Coast Guard helicopter that arrived for medical evacuation was a HH-60 Jayhawk, its twin engines creating downdrafts that turned the ocean surface into a churning mass of spray and foam. The rescue basket dropped toward our boat on a steel cable, swaying in the rotor wash while Coast Guard personnel prepared to lift survivors to the aircraft for emergency medical transport. They loaded me into the basket first, strapping me to the metal framework with restraints designed to prevent movement during the aerial transfer. The rise to the helicopter felt like floating in reverse, rising through downdrafts and engine noise until Coast Guard flight medics pulled me into the aircraft's cabin. "What happened down there?" I asked the flight medic who began attaching monitoring equipment to my body. "The submarine. What happened to the Connecticut?" The medic's response came with professional detachment that avoided answering my question directly. "You're suffering from severe decompression injuries and possible nitrogen narcosis. Try to rest while we transport you to medical facilities." "No, you don't understand. There was something down there. Something alive. It grabbed our submarine and pulled us deeper than any boat can survive." The flight medic made notes on a medical chart while checking my vital signs, his expression showing the kind of patient tolerance that medical personnel develop when dealing with trauma victims who present with disorientation and memory problems. "Nitrogen narcosis can cause vivid hallucinations," he explained, adjusting the flow rate on an oxygen mask covering my nose and mouth. "What you're describing is consistent with pressure-related cognitive impairment. The important thing now is getting you proper medical treatment." Through the helicopter's windows, I could see the other survivors being pulled aboard in rescue baskets. Tyler and Brandon were still unconscious, their bodies showing severe decompression injuries that needed immediate medical care. Whatever process had brought us from the crushed submarine to the surface had damaged our bodies in ways that showed rapid pressure changes beyond anything human bodies were meant to handle. The flight to Guam took several hours, during which Coast Guard medics gave us emergency treatment for decompression sickness while checking our vital signs for complications that could be fatal. I spent the journey trying to piece together my memories of the submarine's final moments, but the sequence stayed broken and incomplete. Naval Medical Center Guam came into view through the helicopter's windows as we approached the landing pad, a large complex of white buildings made to handle military medical emergencies throughout the Pacific region. The facility's trauma unit was already ready for our arrival, with medical teams standing by to treat multiple cases of severe decompression sickness. They moved me from the helicopter to a hospital gurney, rolling me through corridors filled with the sounds and smells of an active medical facility. The emergency room team worked with practiced skill, giving us treatments for pressure-related injuries while running tests to check the extent of tissue damage throughout my body. "Can you describe what you remember about the incident?" a Navy doctor asked while reviewing my medical chart. "Any details about how the submarine was damaged?" "We were investigating an anomaly in the Mariana Trench. Something came up from the bottom, something impossibly large. It grabbed our submarine and pulled us deeper than the hull could handle." The doctor made notes while keeping the same professional distance I'd seen from the Coast Guard medics. Severe pressure exposure can cause detailed hallucinations that seem completely real to the patient. What you're describing doesn't match any known oceanographic phenomena. They admitted me to the hospital for treatment and observation, putting me in a private room where medical staff could monitor my recovery from decompression injuries. The room had a single window that looked out over the Pacific, but I found myself unable to look at the ocean without remembering that massive creature rising from the deep depths. Over the next 2 days, I repeatedly asked medical staff and hospital administrators, about Captain Walker and the other crew members who hadn't survived the incident. Every inquiry met with vague responses that avoided providing specific information about casualties or rescue operations. "The Navy is still conducting search operations," was the standard answer. "More information will be available once the investigation is complete." But I knew from the rescue operations I'd seen that only 7 crew members had reached the surface alive. 30 crew members remained unaccounted for, lost when the Connecticut was crushed at depths that should have made any survival impossible. On my 3rd day in the hospital, a naval officer appeared in my room carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that suggested official business rather than medical consultation. He was older than the hospital staff, with graying hair and the way someone carries themselves when they're used to delivering difficult information. "Petty Officer Thompson, I'm Lieutenant Commander Hayes from Naval Intelligence. I need to inform you of the official findings regarding the USS Connecticut incident." I set down the water glass I'd been holding and gave him my full attention. What happened to Captain Walker? What happened to the rest of my crew? The USS Connecticut suffered a catastrophic equipment failure during routine training operations in the Western Pacific. The submarine was lost with all hands except for 7 survivors who were recovered by Coast Guard search and rescue operations. The words hit me like cold water. Equipment failure, routine training operations. The official explanation had nothing to do with what had actually happened in the deepest part of the Mariana Trench. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "We weren't on a training mission. We were sent to investigate something Harrison had detected in the deep ocean, something alive." Lieutenant Commander Hayes consulted his clipboard with the same professional detachment I'd encountered from every military and medical person since my rescue. "The official investigation has concluded that mechanical failure caused the submarine's pressure hull to breach during a training exercise. Survivor accounts indicate severe nitrogen narcosis and trauma-induced hallucinations. I know what I saw down there. There was a creature, something massive that grabbed our submarine and pulled us deeper than any boat can survive. Captain Walker had orders from Naval Intelligence to investigate an anomaly. The investigation found no evidence of anomalous contacts or intelligence operations. The Connecticut was conducting routine training when equipment failure resulted in the loss of the vessel." Hayes closed his clipboard and looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy with bureaucratic finality. The official story had been written, the paperwork completed, the incident classified according to whatever parameters suited the Navy's institutional needs. But I had seen that enormous eye looking back at me through 40,000 feet of crushing water pressure. I had felt the intelligence behind it, very old and huge and completely beyond human understanding. No official report could change what had actually happened in the depths where humanity was never meant to go. The creature was real, and somewhere in the darkest parts of the ocean, it was still there. The transfer to Naval Medical Center San Diego happened without warning. One morning, I was lying in my hospital bed in Guam, watching Navy doctors look at my decompression injury charts, and by evening I was on a military transport aircraft heading back to the continental United States. The medical staff gave me vague explanations about specialized treatment facilities and continuing care requirements, but their evasive answers made it clear this wasn't about my physical recovery. 7 days had passed since the Coast Guard pulled me from that life raft floating on the Pacific surface. 7 days of medical tests, pain medication, and repeated questions about what I remembered from the Connecticut's final moments. Every conversation with hospital staff followed the same pattern. They would listen to my account of the massive creature with professional patience, make notes about trauma-induced hallucinations, and change the subject to my physical symptoms. The flight to San Diego took most of the night. I spent those hours looking out the aircraft's small windows at the dark Pacific below, trying not to think about what might be moving through the deep water beneath us. My body still hurt from the decompression injuries, sharp pains in my joints that served as constant reminders of surviving something that should have killed me instantly. Naval Medical Center San Diego looked different from the facility in Guam. The buildings were older, more institutional, with the kind of weathered concrete construction that suggested decades of military use. They admitted me to a private room on the third floor, away from the general patient population, in a section that felt more like administrative offices than a hospital ward. The morning after my arrival, a Navy officer appeared in my room carrying a leather briefcase and wearing dress blues with intelligence insignia on his collar. He was older than most of the medical staff I'd encountered, maybe late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that came from years of handling classified information. "Petty Officer Thompson, I'm Commander Robert Clark, Naval Intelligence. I'll be conducting your operational debriefing regarding the USS Connecticut incident." He pulled a chair close to my bed and opened his briefcase, removing a digital recording device and several manila folders marked with classification stamps. His movements had the practiced efficiency of someone who conducted these interviews regularly, though something in his expression suggested this particular debriefing held unusual significance. "The purpose of this session is to gather detailed information about your sonar readings during the submarine's final operational period. I need you to walk me through every contact you detected, every acoustic signature you recorded, and every technical parameter you observed." Clark's request focused specifically on the technical aspects of what I'd seen, avoiding any mention of the creature itself. His approach felt different from the medical staff who had dismissed my accounts as hallucinations. This man wanted the data, the hard technical information about what my equipment had detected in the deep ocean. "Commander, what I recorded down there doesn't match anything in our databases. The acoustic signatures were coming from something alive, something larger than anything that should exist in Earth's oceans." "Let's start with the technical specifications," Clark interrupted, his pen hovering over a notepad. "What was the bearing and range of the initial contact?" I described the sonar readings in detail, walking through each step of the detection process, while Clark took extensive notes. He asked specific questions about frequency patterns, signal strength, acoustic propagation characteristics, and the timing of the rhythmic pulses I'd tracked for hours before the creature began its ascent. "These pulsing patterns," Clark said, his voice carrying new intensity. "Can you describe the intervals between pulses? The exact timing sequence? 12-second intervals precise as a metronome. The acoustic signatures were powerful enough to register clearly from over 2 miles away, but the frequency characteristics didn't match any geological or mechanical source." Clark made detailed notes about the timing patterns, asking me to repeat the information twice while he cross-referenced something in one of his classified folders. Whatever he was comparing my account to seemed to match his expectations in ways that made him lean forward with increased attention. "You mentioned the contact ascending from the abyssal plane. Describe the rate of ascent and any changes in acoustic signature during the creature's movement." The word "creature" slipped out naturally, but Clark didn't correct me or dismiss the term as previous military personnel had done. He simply waited for my technical description while his recording device captured every detail I provided about that impossible encounter. I explained how the massive shape had risen through the water column, generating displacement waves that affected our submarine's position and attitude. Clark asked specific questions about the creature's apparent size, the bioluminescent patterns I'd seen, and the moment when part of its body had extended toward our position like a massive appendage. "The extending structure," Clark said, consulting his notes. "You described it as hundreds of feet in diameter. Can you provide more precise measurements based on your sonar analysis?" Based on acoustic signature analysis, the appendage measured approximately 400 feet in diameter and extended upward for thousands of feet from the main body mass. "But Commander, what I'm telling you is impossible according to every biological model we understand." "Focus on the technical data," Clark replied, his voice carrying a warning tone that suggested I shouldn't question the impossibility of what I'd witnessed. "The Navy needs accurate measurements and acoustic characteristics for our records." Clark spent over an hour collecting detailed technical information about every part of my sonar readings. He was especially interested in the creature's final moments of contact with our submarine, asking the same questions over and over about how the huge tentacles had wrapped around our hull and the changes in sound patterns during our trip down to the crushing depths. When I described seeing the creature's eye looking directly at our submarine, Clark's pen stopped moving across his notepad. For several seconds, he sat perfectly still, studying my face with intense focus that suggested this detail was really important. "You mentioned observing visual characteristics of the contact. Explain exactly what you saw." Part of the creature's appendage opened up, revealing an internal structure that contained an eye, a perfectly formed eye that focused on our submarine with unmistakable intelligence. "Commander, that thing was studying us." Clark made extensive notes about my description of the eye, asking questions about its apparent size, the level of detail I could observe, and my impression of the intelligence behind it. His questions became increasingly specific, as if he was comparing my account to information already contained in his classified folders. "The patterns of bioluminescence you observed," Clark continued. "Did they appear random, or did you notice any organized sequences?" "The patterns were definitely organized. Complex light sequences that seemed to be processing information about our presence. They looked like a form of communication, data transmission between different parts of the creature's anatomy." Clark's recording device captured every word, while he made notes that filled several pages of his official notepad. Whatever I was telling him matched up with information he already had, though he kept the professional distance of someone conducting a routine debriefing rather than discussing impossible biological encounters. After 2 hours of technical questions, Clark closed his notepad and leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed from professional interest to something that looked like satisfaction, as if my account had confirmed details he'd been hoping to verify. "Petty Officer Thompson, what you've described as hallucinations are actually consistent with sonar anomalies that have been detected in ocean trenches worldwide. The Mariana Trench contact was not an isolated incident." The words hit me hard. Clark's admission meant the Navy had been tracking these creatures for who knows how long, picking up their sounds in deep ocean spots around the globe. The Connecticut's mission hadn't been an exploratory operation. It had been a deliberate attempt to make contact with something the military already knew existed. "You sent us down there knowing what we'd find," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "You knew there were things living in the deep ocean, and you sent my crew to investigate without warning us what we were dealing with." Clark's expression remained unchanged, though something in his eyes suggested my realization didn't surprise him. The mission parameters were classified at levels that required careful management of crew knowledge. Full disclosure would have compromised the operation's effectiveness. "Careful management? Commander, 23 crew members died down there. Captain Walker, Dave Rodriguez, Kevin Mitchell, good people who trusted their orders and followed them into a situation they never should have faced. Their sacrifice provided valuable intelligence about deep ocean entities that pose potential threats to national security. The data you've provided today will help us understand these creatures' capabilities and develop appropriate response protocols." Clark's clinical description of my crewmates' deaths as valuable intelligence made my hands start shaking with anger that had nothing to do with decompression injuries. He was discussing the loss of an entire submarine crew as if they were expendable resources rather than human beings who had families and futures that were cut short by bureaucratic decisions made in classified briefing rooms. "You're talking about my friends like they were laboratory animals," I said, no longer caring about military protocol or the recording device capturing our conversation. These were experienced submariners who deserved to know what they were being sent to investigate. "National security sometimes requires difficult decisions about operational security," Clark replied, his voice carrying the kind of cold pragmatism that suggested he'd given this explanation before. "Some discoveries justify any sacrifice necessary to obtain crucial intelligence." Clark opened his briefcase and removed a stack of legal documents bearing official Navy letterhead and multiple classification stamps. The papers looked like contracts or agreements, printed on the kind of high-security paper used for the most sensitive military documentation. The information discussed during this debriefing is classified at levels that exceed most admirals' security clearance. Public disclosure of any details regarding the Connecticut's actual mission would constitute treason against the United States. He placed the documents on the bedside table where I could read the headers and classification markings, non-disclosure agreements, secrecy oaths, legal acknowledgments that I understood the consequences of revealing classified information about deep ocean operations. You have two choices, Petty Officer. Sign these agreements and maintain absolute secrecy about the mission's true nature, or face court-martial proceedings for unauthorized disclosure of information vital to national defense. The documents contained pages of legal language describing criminal penalties for revealing classified information, including potential life imprisonment for disclosing details about deep ocean entities or naval intelligence operations. Clark had made it clear that discussing the creature, the mission parameters, or the real circumstances of my crewmates' deaths would result in prosecution for treason. 23 good people died because you wanted data about something living in the ocean depths, I said, picking up the first document to read its contents. And now you're threatening me to keep quiet about their sacrifice. Their mission provided intelligence that will help protect American interests from threats that exist in environments we're only beginning to understand. The data you collected during your encounter will contribute to research programs that could prevent future casualties. Clark's excuse for my crewmates' deaths sounded like something rehearsed for congressional committees or intelligence oversight panels. He had turned human lives into operational statistics, acceptable losses in pursuit of information about creatures that challenged humanity's understanding of life on Earth. I read through the non-disclosure agreements while Clark waited with the patience of someone who knew I had no real choice in the matter. The legal language was comprehensive, covering every aspect of the Connecticut's mission from our departure from San Diego to the creature encounter that had crushed our submarine at impossible depths. The mission was a complete success, Clark said, gathering his recording equipment while I signed the documents that would legally bind me to silence. We obtained a detailed technical data about deep ocean entities that will inform future operations in these environments. Complete success. 23 crew members dead, a submarine lost, survivors suffering from decompression injuries that would affect us for the rest of our lives. And Clark considered the mission successful because they had gotten the intelligence they wanted. I signed the final document and handed the stack back to Clark, who looked over each signature before placing the agreements in his briefcase. I realized I could never discuss the real circumstances of my crewmates' deaths without facing prosecution for treason. Your cooperation in this matter serves the national interest, Clark said, standing and adjusting his uniform. The information you've provided will contribute to research that could save American lives in future deep ocean operations. Clark left my hospital room carrying his briefcase full of technical data about impossible creatures living in the deepest parts of Earth's oceans. I stayed in bed, legally bound to silence about the truth behind the Connecticut's mission and the real reason why 23 good people had died in the crushing darkness below. The official story would list their deaths as casualties of equipment failure during routine training operations. Only a handful of people would ever know that they had been deliberately sent to make contact with very old intelligences that lived in the deepest depths, creatures so massive and powerful that governments would sacrifice entire submarine crews just to study them. The discharge papers arrived exactly 1 month later. I was still in the hospital bed at Naval Medical Center San Diego when a Navy administrator delivered the manila envelope containing my honorable discharge documentation. The official reason listed psychological unfitness for duty following traumatic submarine incident, which sounded clinical enough to avoid raising questions about the real circumstances behind my departure from military service. 12 years of submarine duty reduced to a single paragraph describing my inability to continue serving due to trauma-related psychological conditions. The paperwork made no mention of the classified debriefing sessions, the non-disclosure agreements I'd signed, or the technical intelligence I'd provided about creatures living in the ocean's deepest trenches. Commander Clark had visited twice more during my final weeks in the hospital, conducting additional interviews that focused on specific details about the creature's acoustic signatures and bioluminescent communication patterns. Each session reinforced the legal constraints surrounding my knowledge while extracting every piece of technical data the Navy could use for their deep ocean research programs. The discharge came with full medical benefits and a disability rating that would provide monthly compensation for the decompression injuries that continued affecting my joints and muscles. The Navy took care of their personnel, even those who knew too much about operations that officially never happened. Finding civilian housing in San Diego turned out easier than adjusting to life without the structured routine of military service. I rented a small apartment in Pacific Beach, specifically choosing a unit that faced away from the ocean because the sound of waves triggered responses I couldn't control. Even the distant rumble of surf through closed windows was enough to make me panic with memories of crushing water pressure. Job hunting became an exercise in discovering how thoroughly my military experience had been contaminated by knowledge I couldn't discuss. Marine supply companies wanted someone with submarine sonar expertise, but I couldn't look at acoustic equipment without seeing that massive eye staring back at me through 40,000 feet of dark water. Harbor Patrol offered positions that required ocean work, but the thought of being on a boat made my chest tighten with panic that had nothing to do with rational fear. I eventually found work at an electronics store in Mission Valley, selling navigation equipment to recreational sailors who wanted GPS systems and fish finders for weekend trips. The irony wasn't lost on me, spending my days explaining sonar principles to people who would never need to detect signatures from creatures that shouldn't exist. The panic attacks started 2 months after my discharge. The first one happened when I was walking past Crystal Pier and heard the rhythmic sound of waves hitting the concrete supports below. The 12-second intervals between impacts matched the creature's pulsing patterns perfectly, triggering a response that sent me to my knees on the boardwalk, while concerned tourists asked if I needed medical attention. Dr. Martinez became my therapist through the Veterans Administration, a patient professional who listened to my carefully edited accounts of submarine trauma without pressing for details I couldn't legally provide. I described nightmares about crushing water pressure and the deaths of my crewmates, but never mentioned the massive tentacles or the intelligence behind that enormous eye. Survivor's guilt is common among veterans who lost colleagues in traumatic incidents, Dr. Martinez explained during our weekly sessions. Your brain is trying to process the experience by creating elaborate scenarios that explain why you survived when others didn't. I let him believe my descriptions of impossible sea creatures were trauma-induced fantasies because correcting him would have broken federal law. The non-disclosure agreements covered every aspect of my knowledge about deep ocean entities, making it illegal for me to seek proper treatment for experiences that officially never happened. 6 months into civilian life, I tried contacting the families of my deceased crewmates. Captain Walker's wife lived in Virginia Beach. Dave Rodriguez had parents in New Mexico, and Kevin Mitchell's family maintained an address in Oregon. Each phone call led to the same devastating discovery. Official Navy records listed their deaths as casualties of equipment failure during routine training exercises. Mrs. Walker described receiving a visit from naval officers who explained that her husband had died when the Connecticut suffered mechanical problems during a standard patrol mission in the Western Pacific. Dave's parents had been told their son was killed in an engineering accident that caused catastrophic flooding. Kevin's family received condolences for his death during a navigation equipment malfunction that led to the submarine's loss. None of the families knew their loved ones had been sent to investigate creatures living in the Mariana Trench. None of them understood that Captain Walker, Dave, and Kevin had died because bureaucrats in Washington decided that gathering intelligence about old ocean entities justified sacrificing an entire submarine crew. James was excited about the patrol, Mrs. Walker told me during our brief phone conversation. He said they were finally getting to use the Connecticut's advanced sonar systems for important intelligence work. He never mentioned anything dangerous about the mission. I wanted to tell her that her husband had died trying to make contact with something that had been watching humanity from the deep ocean trenches for thousands of years. I wanted to explain that Captain Walker's sacrifice had provided technical data about creatures so massive and intelligent that governments would kill to study them. But the legal agreements I'd signed made telling the truth an act of treason. I tried reaching Tyler Foster and Brandon Lee through Veterans Administration channels and military alumni networks, but both had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of medical transfers and classified patient relocations. Questions about where they were got responses that their medical information was protected by privacy regulations and national security considerations. The message was clear. The Navy had separated the 3 survivors to prevent us from comparing our experiences or coordinating our accounts of what had happened in the deep ocean. We had been scattered across different facilities and support systems to ensure that the truth about the Connecticut's mission stayed contained within official channels. 18 months after my discharge, I contacted investigative journalists at the San Diego Union Tribune and the Los Angeles Times, hoping that media pressure might force disclosure of the real circumstances behind the submarine's loss. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial interest in a Navy cover-up story, followed by doubt when they realized I couldn't provide documentation or physical evidence to support my claims. "You're asking me to publish a story about sea monsters based on the testimony of a submarine veteran who suffered traumatic brain injury during a classified incident," one reporter explained. "Without independent verification or Navy sources willing to go on record, this isn't journalism, it's science fiction." The non-disclosure agreements had been made to prevent exactly this scenario. My legal constraints made it impossible to provide the detailed technical evidence that would convince journalists to investigate further, while the Navy's classification system made sure that no official sources would confirm information about deep ocean entities. 3 years of therapy helped me develop coping mechanisms for the panic attacks and insomnia that continued affecting my daily life. Dr. Martinez taught me breathing exercises for managing anxiety responses and prescribed medications that reduced the frequency of nightmares about tentacles wrapping around submarine hulls. But no amount of treatment could address the main problem. I had knowledge about threats to humanity that I couldn't share with the people who needed to understand the danger. Every night, I went to sleep knowing that massive intelligences lived in the ocean depths, creatures so very old and powerful that they had been watching civilizations rise and fall from their deep domains. The nightmares never stopped completely. I would dream about that enormous eye looking directly at me through crushing water pressure, studying our submarine with the kind of patient attention that suggested thousands of years of watching. Sometimes I dreamed about the creature's glowing communication networks covering ocean trenches like neural pathways in a mind larger than entire continents. The worst dreams were the ones where I felt the creature's tentacles adjusting their grip on our failing submarine, holding us with just enough pressure to prevent implosion, while carrying us deeper into an environment where human survival was impossible. Those nightmares always ended with the understanding that the creature had deliberately chosen which crew members would survive to reach the surface. We hadn't escaped the Connecticut's destruction. We had been released. The creature had selected 3 survivors out of 37 crew members and placed us in life rafts where Coast Guard rescue operations would find us. But the question of why we had been chosen and what the creature expected from us remained unanswered. Working at the electronics store provided enough income to maintain my apartment and pay for continued therapy. But every day felt like an exercise in pretending that the world was smaller and safer than I knew it to be. Customers would ask about sonar equipment specifications, while I remembered detecting signatures from creatures that challenged everything humanity understood about life on Earth. The isolation was the hardest part, living with knowledge that couldn't be shared, carrying memories of experiences that officially never happened, watching the ocean from my apartment window while knowing what moved through its deepest trenches. The legal constraints around my silence meant that the burden of this knowledge would remain mine alone until I died. 3 years after the Connecticut's mission, I understood that humanity shared the planet with intelligences so vast and very old that our entire civilization existed within their awareness, like insects crawling across the surface of their domain. The creatures living in deep trenches had knowledge accumulated since before the continents reached their current positions, watching countless species evolve and disappear while they remained constant in the deep darkness. The governments of the world knew about these entities and had decided that studying them justified any sacrifice necessary to obtain intelligence about their capabilities. Submarine crews would continue being sent into the deep ocean on classified missions, sacrificing human lives to gather data about creatures that operated on geological timescales. And somewhere in the deepest parts of the Pacific, those very old intelligences continued their patient watching of humanity, communicating through glowing networks that covered ocean basins, while they waited for reasons that only they understood. The creature that had looked directly at me through our submarine's failing hull had been evaluating us, studying our technology and our responses to contact with something beyond human understanding. I know the truth about what lives in the ocean depths, horrors beyond anything humanity has imagined, very old and powerful and watching. The Pacific looks peaceful from my apartment window, but beneath its surface, creatures the size of mountains move through trenches deeper than our highest peaks, with intelligence that has been watching our species since we first ventured onto the water in primitive boats. The ocean keeps its secrets, and the government makes sure that some knowledge remains buried deeper than any submarine can reach. But I was there when humanity made contact with something that had been waiting in the darkness for millions of years, and I know that our time as the dominant intelligence on this planet is shorter than we believe. They're still down there, watching and waiting, and someday they'll decide that their period of watching is complete.